What's up my dudes, welcome back to the channel. My name is Jambre and today I'm going to be going through a deck guide for a Shaman deck that I created and recently hit rank 1 legend on Europe. That's right, on Europe, the best server. So let's look at the deck list. I will go through each card and give its purpose and why it's in the deck. First card we have is Mutate. This card is very synergistic with Mogu Flesh Shaper, another card we'll talk about later, and Former Champ. They're the two main targets I would say for it. Basically, bunch of stats for 0 mana. Play the Mogu, trade in something, mutate the Mogu into an 8-drop. Everyone knows this thing. They've seen it before, nothing special there. Next we have Zap, and if I'm talking about Zap, I may also talk about all the Overload cards together and the Thunderhead, because they're all very synergistic. So the 4 Overload cards we have are Zap, Lightning Bolt, Voltaic Burst, and Sludge Surfer. And they all synergize with Thunderhead, most of them costing 1, with Zap costing 0. This is a great mid-game tempo tool, which puts out a load of minions onto the board instantly, which then has synergy with things like Sea Giant and Mogu Flesh Shaper. And if they stick around, then you can synergize them perhaps with Vicina, Bloodlust, or the Stormbringer. Now a card like Zap is particularly good with Thunderhead, as you can play them both on turn 4, and combo with any other 1 mana Overload cards you have in hand as well. Lightning Bolt is actually pretty good in this meta, where Priest is very prevalent. Priests have a lot of 3 health minions that are threats that need to die, things like Cleric and Tolvir and Blade Master, potentially all targets for this Lightning Bolt. Next up we have in the 1-drop slot Mermy, 1 mana 1/1 Murloc with Reborn. Not the most spectacular card, and actually probably one of the weaker cards in the deck. It basically serves as a curve filler. Whenever you have a turn where you haven't got stuff to do, Mermy can fill that hole. Synergizes well with Underbelly Angler being a cheap Murloc. Basically you can chain off that way. It also is fairly sticky, so when it comes to trying to do swing turns with Mogu Flesh Shaper and Sea Giants, you may already have a minion on board because of the Mermy. Why do we run Mermy in the deck over things like perhaps a Tidecaller or a Toxfin, both strong cards in their own right? Well, this isn't a very heavy Murloc deck, so in terms of buffing those cards, it's really only the Sludge Surfer and the Underbelly Angler and nothing else, so you might not get that much synergy there. Our deck already has a ton of board control options available already, so something like Toxfin to add to that doesn't really have as much impact as it does in Murloc decks, and you're not going to find that target as often. And playing a 1 mana 1/2 with nothing is way worse than playing a 1/1 Reborn. Next we have Sludge Surfer, one of the strongest 1-drops in Standard right now. Has a lot of synergy in the deck, it's an Overload card, gets you lackeys to spread wide onto board, and it is a Murloc, so it synergizes with Underbelly Angler. Something to watch out for with this card is you don't always want to be playing it on turn 1. If you have a Lickum in hand, you might want to wait till turn 2 to play a Sludge Surfer. That way you have a Lickum active on turn 3. If you were to play the Sludge on 1 and your Lackey on 2, well, you might be stuck in hand with a Lickum which hasn't got its bonus attack, or you'd have to expend another Overload card to do so. So sometimes it's best to just hold the Sludge Surfer. Also for Underbelly Angler is another reason why you might want to not play the Sludge on 1, just so you get that additional value by playing the Underbelly Angler first. So something to watch out for with that card. Voltaic Burst is next. That's a card we spoke a little bit about before. This card has very good synergy with both Mogu Flesh Shaper and Sea Giant. It's going to allow you to play those cards way cheaper. And if you do have a card like Mogu Flesh Shaper in that mulligan, it might be worth keeping Voltaic Burst alongside it, just to get that additional synergy. Some things to consider with this card is board space in particular. If you have a Thunderhead up as well, you are going to be very limited by board space, so consider if you want to be Voltaic Bursting first before your other Overload cards, so you don't end up losing out on a little bit of value just because you can't summon as many minions. Another thing to note is, although it does have Rush, you may be in some spots where you don't want to just kill off your minions, and you just want to leave them as 1/1s spread wide, make your opponent try to clean them up. If your opponent doesn't have AoEs in their deck or pings available, they're going to have to be trading into your minions, and when you're running things like Sea Giant, Stormbringer and Bloodlust, it can be better to just spread wide and leave the minions not attacking, even though they do have Rush. The card also has great synergy with Vicina. Just a simple case of Vicina plus these on turn 5, you get 2 3/1 rushes, which is great for board control. Next we have Evil Totem. This is a great 2-drop. It is repetitive value, it must be killed, and if you have board control you get rewarded for playing cards like this. And this deck has board control for days. Things like Lickum, all our overload removal cards, and Thunderhead mean we get ahead on board very easily and we are able to hold it. So dropping something like a Totem in that case allows us to just get repetitive value and repetitive tempo. One thing I would note about this card is that you do sometimes want to be evolving it either via a mutate or through the evolve lackey. Don't fall into the trap in tempo matchups where your opponent has a minion who is going to be killing your totem next turn, but you have the option to use an evolve lackey on it, but you decide not to because you want to get another lackey from it. I think the immediate stat increase from going from a 0-2 or a 0-1 up to a 3-drop outweighs the extra lackey that you get in hand a lot of the time, so that is something you should be looking out for. Coining out this card in Quest Shaman is often a very good play, but in this sort of deck, make sure you do have the curve to follow it up. It can be often better times to just pass turn 1 and just play this on turn 2. But if you have the ways to fill out your tempo and fill out your mana whilst coining it out, it's usually the stronger play. Next up we have Lickum, and this card is really good in this meta game right now. Priest is very much dominant and this card is great against Priest. You may have heard many people saying that Northshire Cleric isn't broken, it's just that they removed the counters to it, like things like Fiery War Axe. Well, this is Fiery War Axe with an extra durability a lot of the time, and this card is insane in getting you board control. Something you might want to be doing when using Lickum is overloading on turn 2 instead of equipping the Lickum and then playing Lickum on 3. Something like Voltaic Burst on turn 2 can be pretty good if your opponent doesn't have much of a board, even though you're floating a mana on that turn. Then on your turn 3 you equip the Lickum to trade into whatever minion your opponent plays, and then you're not overloaded for turn 4, so you're free to drop something like a Thunderhead or a Vicina if you have them. Next up, Underbelly Angler. This card cheeses out so many wins. It's a pretty disgusting card when it pops off. The RNG is a bit annoying. There are a couple 4-drop Murlocs that you can get straight away and it will completely ruin your chain, especially when you're usually chaining with a Sludge Surfer which overloads you as well. So even 3-drops sometimes aren't playable from this card. But yeah, this thing can potentially snowball a game into a victory pretty early. Something to watch out for with this card is focusing too hard on value. At the end of the day, in this style of deck, the goal is to push as much tempo every single turn. Underbelly Angler helps that by giving you almost limitless amounts of value, but you need to be transitioning that value into tempo onto the board. So even if you have a Murloc available for the Angler every turn, it's not always the best thing to do. Sometimes it'll be a case you play Underbelly Angler plus a Sludge Slurper and your opponent develops a minion on the next turn and you have a Murloc available to play, but it could be a better idea of going for something like a Lickum instead and then going for the Murlocs later on. It's all context dependent, but remember, tempo is the key at the end of the day, although Underbelly Angler and a bunch of Murlocs, usually you can't go too wrong. Now you might be wondering why there's no 3-mana cards in this deck, and largely the reason for that revolves around Lickum itself. A lot of times you want to be structuring your curve to overload on specific turns just to make a Lickum really good, and turn 3 gets a bit awkward. You don't usually want to be overloading on turn 3 so you can play Thunderhead on 4 if you have a Zap, for example. Other times you'll be equipping a Lickum on turn 2 and you'll need something to answer on turn 3, so you'll be playing an overload card on your turn 3 instead of developing whatever 3-mana card you would have put in the deck. And then you're only really playing it on turn 4 in that case, and beyond turn 4 you're doing things like a 4-drop and a 1-drop, or you're doing 5-drops, etc, etc, and actually slotting in a 3-mana card becomes difficult, and there's a very narrow window of opportunity to do so. Basically because of all the cheap overload cards that you'll be having to play throughout the game, fitting a 3-mana card into the curve can be quite difficult at times. Okay, in the 4-drop slot, let's talk about Thunderhead. This card is insane for board control. It's insane for getting minions on board to make Mogus cheap, like Sea Giants cheap. When you're using this card, be very careful with making it vulnerable. For instance, if you're not ahead on board and you have cards like Mogu in hand and a Thunderhead in hand, say your opponent's got a 3-3 and a 2-3 on board, well, dropping a 3-6 into that on turn 4 normally would be a great idea because you set up 2 value trades. But we can do better than that in this deck. We can take a turn off perhaps, go a little bit slow, and then on turn 5, or maybe even turn 6, if you have to really get greedy, if you're falling behind on board, you do Thunderhead plus the Overload cards on one turn. You make enough minions on board to make maybe a Sea Giant really cheap or a Mogu really cheap, and you just swing the board back that way. When you're playing this deck, you really want to be just looking for constant swing turns. You want to be counting how many minions you get to put on board to make a Mogu really cheap or a Sea Giant really cheap, and going for those out. Something like Thunderhead plus Voltaic Burst puts 5 minions straight onto the board, and you have 2 extra board slots to play a Mogu or a Sea Giant. And if your opponent's loading up board, yes, you're falling behind for now, but these swing turns are so powerful that you almost want them to build up their side of the board just so you can go for these Thunderhead plus the rushing elementals into Sea Giant / Mogu swing turns. Next up in the 4-drop slot we have the Cena. This is almost like a third Bloodlust, I would say, in the deck, although it is a little bit better for mana because it's cheaper, but it is conditional and for less attack, but it also is potentially repetitive effect. Something you could do against like a priest, for instance, is on turn 4, they've got, you know, a few minions but not with high attack. You could just drop a Vicina onto the board, and often priest plays are just dropping minions, buffing their health and things, and they're actually somewhat limited in how much attack buffs they can do. There's really just the inner fires and maybe one of extra arms that are great for buffing attack, so that you can sometimes get into situations where you can just drop Vicina onto a board. It's got 6 health, it's quite hard for low attack minions to be able to kill it, and then the next turn you can do the Thunderhead swing with Thunderhead plus whatever overload card you have, and you'll completely swing the board and just delete the priest from the game. And it is something that I've done a few times. Other than that, pretty much acts like a third Bloodlust. Very strong card. Speaking of Bloodlust, we have Bloodlust. This card is just basically how you convert your board advantage into a victory. Pretty bad card in hand until it's a great card when you win the game with it. That's pretty much how you sum up Bloodlust. It's almost dead in hand for many, many turns until it's not. Something I would say about a Bloodlust is be careful just using it because you think it's decent this turn. Say you have 4 minions on board, you know, oh, that's good enough for a Bloodlust, I'll get them for this much damage in the face and then try and finish them off later. This can be pretty bad because essentially, in terms of board control, you've passed your turn. All you've done is done face damage, and against a lot of decks, this can be a mistake if you don't have the burst damage in hand, which is kind of hard with this deck. There's really only Lickham and Lightning Bolt for damage from hand. You do need board control to win. So sometimes, if you do have a Bloodlust available, it's not always correct to take it, and instead try to develop your board a little bit more and then go for a greedier Bloodlust to actually deliver lethal. Other uses for Bloodlust, it synergizes fairly okayly with Voltaic Burst, particularly if you have other minions on board. Something like Voltaic Burst, Bloodlust, you use the rush minions to clean up any of their side of the board, and then you push face with the rest of your minions. Can be a good turn. Next we have Former Champ, one of the perhaps weaker cards in the deck, but is probably necessary to make Mutate a better card. You don't always have a good Mogu Flesh Shaper to evolve, so just having another synergy card for it is powerful. It is a little bit hard sometimes to fit Former Champ into your mana curves because of the overload cards. Something you could look into doing is going Coin Former Champ Mutate as a powerful play, and then following up with a Thunderhead plus overload cards, and that is going to be better for your curve. If you went Thunderhead plus overload cards straight away, you'd be overloaded on the next turn, you wouldn't be able to play the Former Champ. So sometimes it's best to play the Former Champ first before the Thunderhead, even though it's a bit worse for board control. Other than that, it is 2 bodies on a 5-drop, and it's decent enough stats for a 5-drop, a 5/5 plus a 1/1. It's fairly vanilla, which is pretty good, but it's 2 bodies which are going to help with your go wide. synergy cards. Next, in the 6 mana slot, we have the Stormbringer. It's probably the weakest of the reward cards for having a wide board. I'm talking about Bloodlust and Vicina, just because it is very expensive. But this card can potentially just win you games. If you manage to just spread wide enough and your opponent can't deal with it, you just convert all that board into huge amounts of stats and potentially finish the game from there. One of my favourite things to do against a Druid is if I have a Thunderhead and a Zap, I will look towards going for Stormbringer as well. And I'll just go Thunderhead, drop it on the board, and when it comes to turn 6, I'll use that Zap. Even if the opponent has no minions, I'll use it on my own guy, just to make those tokens and then convert everything into the Stormbringer. I'd say the Stormbringer is one of those cards that you really need to plan around. It is the most expensive card in the deck usually, and it has the requirement of you having a wide board. I'd say it's usually not worth playing this card on 1 or 2 minions unless you're in a super desperate situation. Try to really milk its value and go for that, 5 board of legendaries. Something you can do if you're going for a Stormbringer victory out is save things like Voltaic Burst in hand, or if you've got a Faceless Lackey from your Lackey generators, save that and then combo on maybe turn 7 or 8. And even better, if a Thunderhead sticks, you can go Voltaic Burst plus Stormbringer, or turn 8 you can go Faceless Lackey, Voltaic Burst, Stormbringer, and just get a bunch of legendaries straight away. Definitely a hard card to play with. You really need to plan around this card. And you also need to know when to abandon going for it. Sometimes it's just necessary to overload onto the board on turn 5 and just block your Stormbringer, and then just go for it later. Don't fixate on going for it. It is a strong card in the right circumstance, but those circumstances are somewhat hard to meet a lot of the time. But if you can meet them, it's often game winning. Finally, we have the mana cheating cards in Mogu Fleshshaper and Sea Giant. Mogu Fleshshaper was one of the best cards in Quest Shaman, and that's a deck that cannot explode onto board with minions as quickly and as easily as this deck can. It is absolutely a powerhouse in this deck. And it actually has great synergy itself, not only with Mutate, but with Sea Giant itself. Because oftentimes the Mogu Fleshshaper is going to come down for 0 mana, and that's going to reduce your Sea Giant as well by 1 mana. And sometimes you have these incredible swing turns where you go Thunderhead plus Overload, plus Mogu, plus Sea Giant, plus a Mutate on your Mogu, and you're just completely dominating the board from that spot. Those sort of swing turns are what really makes this deck powerful, and it's what you should be looking for in tempo matchups. Sea Giant itself is a little bit harder to get down than the Mogu, being 3 mana more expensive, but it is potentially really strong. If you have a Sea Giant in hand, maybe perhaps look to delay some of your swing turns just by a little bit so you can get the Sea Giant alongside with them, because once you've done your swing turn with the Thunderheads and all the rushes, you often get in a scenario where your opponent starts trading away your minions and you don't have that immediate minion explosion onto the board anymore, and you've kind of missed your chance, and you might just end up with a Sea Giant in hand for the rest of the game that can't come down. So sometimes it's best to play it a bit slow for a turn, even though you could pop off, and then just pop off on the turn after, just so you can get that Sea Giant alongside with it. Against something like Druid, Sea Giant is really good because usually what happens is you build up almost a full board before they complete the quest, and once they complete the quest, they starfall your entire board away, and it's really hard to have it survive since all your totems are 2 health. But a great thing to do is to just plop down a Sea Giant when they want to do that, because it has 8 health, which is 1 more than 7. Big brains up here, and that just dodges Starfall. In terms of card draw and things, I've experimented in the past with things like Geppetto, Shadowwalk, Storm Chaser, Murloc Tasty Fin, all these card draw options, and I think they're not good for the meta game right now, and they're not good for the deck. Right now there's a bunch of tempo decks, and I include Druid in this example as a tempo deck. If you have card draw against a Druid, it's not going to allow you to out-tempo them in the late game against things like Oasis Surger and Starfalls. You're still going to fall behind in that case. It's much better to beat a Druid by getting a huge tempo start initially and not worry about longevity of the game. You want to be trying to beat them around turn 5, you build up your big advantage and close the game out by around turn 7 or 8. Decks like Priest, like Quest Shaman are very, very similar. Priest is a bit different in that they're not beating you in the late game, you're beating them. But you need to get the tempo advantage early so they don't beat you in the early game, because any early advantage that Priest gets, they just snowball so hard into a victory with things like Cleric, things like Divine Spirit, etc. So although you have the late game on a Priest, the way to beat a Priest is through the early game. Things like Quest Shaman, again, they're not very good in the early game. They allow you to get onto board. They play a bunch of minions that don't affect the board as well, which are going to help out your Sea Giants and your Mogu Flesh Shapers. And that's going to allow you to snowball the board into a victory before the quest can get to the late game, where they're going to out-tempo you completely with their double battle cries. Having said that, because of the direction we've taken this deck and going super hard on tempo, has left us with a weakness against Control Warriors. Control Warriors, unfortunately, have a reset tempo button in the form of Brawl, which means that any sort of tempo advantage you get early can be just completely neutered through the use of that spell. So although we've got massive tempo, and we always get a tempo advantage eventually against a warrior, it can get reset so easily that it means that that matchup turns into a bad one. But fortunately, it's not a super popular deck right now. I wouldn't say it's unpopular, but things like Priest and Quest Shaman and Druid are way more popular, at least in my experience. Okay, let's talk about mulligans and what cards you should be keeping. There is a little bit of data available on HS Replay since I tweeted the deck. There's been around 2,000 games been played with it, and the results on there are fairly similar to what I would suggest as well for mulligans. Mogu Flesh Shaper, by far the best card in the deck in pretty much every matchup. Even against something like Druid, where they don't put a lot of things onto the board early on, it's still a very strong card. So pretty much an always keep for Mogu. Then you have Underbelly Anglers and Evil Totems as your 2-drops. Also probably want to be keeping them alongside a Lickum in some matchups. In matchups where you're essentially the super aggressor, like against OTK Paladin or Control Warrior, Lickum isn't so good of a keep, as you want to be really going for a proactive, aggressive game plan, and you don't want to be reacting to what they're doing just as much. Looking at HS Replay and the kept percentages, Mermy is very high on the kept percent, but it's not great on the mulligan win rate, and this is understandable. It's not a very good card for getting board control particularly. It's only got 1 attack, and there's no real way to buff its attack. Going first, I think keeping Mermy without any other 1-drops is absolutely fine, but on the coin, I would really recommend mulligan away Mermy for your stronger cards. However, if you do have an Underbelly Angler already in your mulligan, definitely keep the Mermy just as an activator for that. But for the majority of the time, you want to be throwing away Mermies if you have other plays available or if you're on the coin. Generally, the cards you want to be keeping in the majority of matches are Sludge Surfer, Underbelly Angler, Lickum, Mogu Flesh Shaper, and Thunderhead, and Evil Totem. That sounds like quite a lot, but you want to be generally hard keeping them. And then, depending on context, if you say already have a Mogu in hand, you might want to be keeping a Voltaic Burst Flip, since they have such great synergy. If you have a Lickum, again, Voltaic Burst may be a good card, particularly against Quest Shaman. It's very strong, because oftentimes they will coin out an Evil Totem or play an Evil Totem on turn 2, and the Voltaic Burst free kills that totem. So it's a pretty strong card in that particular matchup, but it's probably a card you don't want to be keeping on its own, or even with just like a Thunderhead, for example. It's a very synergistic card, but not a card you want to be keeping on its own unless you have those synergies available already. The mulligans are very context dependent in this deck. When looking at something like former champ Mutate, you would never keep a Mutate on its own, and you never ever keep a former champ on its own. When you've got them together, particularly on the coin, and particularly if you already have some earlier plays available in your mulligan, those are the cards you might want to be looking to keep as well. And Mutate as well is a card that synergizes really well with Mogu, so if you've got a Mogu, maybe you want to be keeping a Mutate alongside it. So when thinking about your mulligan, don't just go on HS Replay look at the highest mulligan win rate cards and be like, oh, I want them and nothing else. You have to be adaptive and flexible. Look for where the synergy cards are and keep some alongside. I will say, however, even though they're synergy cards, I would not be looking to keep Voltaic Burst, Lightning Bolt alongside a Thunderhead on its own. Basically, the chances by turn 5 that you hit Thunderhead plus a 1-cost Overload card is very, very high. So keeping a 1-cost Overload card in your mulligan with the anticipation of using it with your Thunderhead on turn 5 just isn't necessary, because you're very likely to pick up another one along the way anyway. But on the other hand, Zap is a different case, because Zap is the only 0-cost Overload card in the deck, so keeping a Zap along with Thunderhead is definitely recommended. So when it comes to keeping Thunderhead, I would not keep Overload cards alongside it, except for Zap and except for Sludge Surfer, but I'm only keeping Sludge Surfer because it's a good early game card. I'm not keeping it because it has synergy with Thunderhead. So as you familiarize yourself with the deck, look for these scenarios which have really good synergies together and keep your mulligans adaptive. Okay, let's talk about matchups. First one is Priest we're going to talk about. This is actually a very good matchup for this deck, and it's primarily one of the reasons why I was so successful with this deck. I was basically farming a bunch of Priests on ladder who thought their deck was untouchable and no one had a favoured matchup against it. This deck counters that notion basically just through its extreme board control and removal. You have things like Lickham, which farms Priest. You have things like Thunderhead, which keeps Priest off the board, and you have things like Mogu and even sometimes Sea Giant, which just, interacts with their board out of nowhere, which is something Priest hates. They really need to be on the board to snowball, and if you can stop that snowball, you're going to just pull ahead and beat them. So what do we want to be looking for against Priest, and how do we want to be playing? Lickham is one of the strongest cards against Priest. That is a definite card you want to be looking for. Something like Evil Totem isn't quite as good, I would say, against Priest in particular, just because the matchup is so dependent on board control early, and Evil Totem doesn't have any stats. It's oftentimes going to get value traded over 1 or 2 turns if you can't quite keep board control. So what are some things to watch out for against Priest? The main way to beat Priest is through tempo. Keep them off the board and they can't do anything. Another way, limit their card draw. Kill the Cleric. Rule number 1 of Priest, I'd say, is kill the Cleric. Without card draw, they don't hit all their synergies and they don't blow you out of the game through tempo. Rule number 2, kill Injured Tolvir if you can. This is a card they love to snowball off the back of, giving it health buffs, healing it up, etc, because it protects all their other minions. If there's a big taunt in the way that you can't get through, you can't value trade into anything else they got, and things start getting super annoying, and things like Inner Fire start becoming a problem in the future. So if like a Tolvir is dropped in turn 2, and you have a 2-drop available and a Lightning Bolt, I would choose to do the Lightning Bolt over the 2-drop, just to get rid of the snowball chances that they have on this Injured Tolvir. Yes, killing a Tolvir and nothing else opens you up to a potentially strong Psychopomp. The Psychopomp plays into our plays of Sea Giant and Mogu Flesh Shaper, so it's not always the worst thing in the world if they get a good Psychopomp off. Another great way to beat Priest is to have simply bigger minions than them. Outside of Inner Fire, Priest doesn't have many attack buffs available at all, so if you have like a 5-5 against their 2-7 Amit, you're coming out way ahead in that scenario. Which brings me to High Priest Amit. Although High Priest Amit is super scary, and you want to be killing him if you can, so they can't snowball their health advantage onto the board. But say you're in a situation where they've played Amit and they've played a Light Warden alongside it, or a Cleric alongside it, and you've got a few big minions. Well, it might be a better idea to kill the Cleric to limit their card draw so they can't play as many minions or get as much tempo onto the board, even though the minions that they do play are going to get that health buff. Same thing with a Light Warden. If you've got big minions on your side of the board, that 2-7 Amit is going to do a terrible job at cleaning up your side of the board. It's going to do a terrible job at pushing face damage, but the Light Warden itself has potential to grow its attack immensely, so it could be a better idea to threat check the Light Warden before the Amit in that scenario. It's all a bit context dependent. Sometimes you want to be doing one thing, sometimes you want to be doing another. You'll get the feel for the matchup as you play it out. Once you're ahead on board, you're probably going to snowball that into a victory. But one thing to watch out for is Wild Pyromancer. If you're very far ahead on board, don't take super greedy trades into their things and let your board be super weak to a Wild Pyromancer. Another thing you can do is actually use Bloodlust for board control. Oftentimes you're actually going to be able to spread wide a bit against Priest, and since they don't usually have great ways to remove wide boards outside of a Wild Pyromancer, a Bloodlust is going to be available a lot of the times, and using a Bloodlust to just clean up their side of the board is oftentimes an excellent use, even if you're not going to be able to push lethal damage in the near future. Having said all that about removing the Priest boards, don't go out of your mind trying to do it and hurting your own tempo. Say you have like Voltaic Burst in hand, and you want to be using that alongside a Thunderhead in the future, or you want to be using that alongside a Mogu Flesh Shaper in the future. Say your opponent plays a Light Warden on turn 1, your hand is Voltaic Burst, Mogu Flesh Shaper, and some other things. Don't go ahead and Voltaic Burst just to kill the Light Warden. That Light Warden is not as great a threat as you think, and going up towards like turn 4, you're going to have a huge swing turn available where maybe the Mogu Flesh Shaper even value trades into the Light Warden, or you can clean it up later. Priest has no damage from hand. If you keep him off the board, they lose. The game plan against Priest isn't to avoid taking damage. The game plan is to get them off the board. And if you have to take a bunch of damage to do that, but you achieve your board control victory, you're going to win, even if you get as low as 1 health by the end of it. So you remove threats where you can, particularly Cleric and Injured Tolvir. But outside of that, look to go for your swing turns, because leaving Priest with a slight board advantage for now can be okay as long as they haven't got threatening minions, because you're going to get those swing turns with Mogu Flesh Shapers and Sea Giants perhaps, or with Thunderheads in the future. Okay, Quest Shaman. This is a favourable matchup, particularly with Sea Giants in the deck as well. In this matchup, you want to be getting an early board advantage, and particularly look for swing turns. Usually what's going to happen in the early turns is both players are going to end up just putting stats onto the board, and the amount of minions on board is going to ramp up. So you should be counting the amount of minions, looking at what things you have in hand, and trying to manipulate the turns so you can activate your Sea Giants, so you can activate your Mogus. Now, on the other hand, the Quest Shaman also has access to Mogu Flesh Shaper, so you yourself need to be limiting the amount of minions you put onto the board until you get to your swing turns, because the Quest Shaman itself doesn't have access to the instant board generation that we do. And when we do our instant board generation, we can also instantly remove our minions because they all have rush. We can just trade them into the opposing side. So what tends to happen is, if you don't give your opponent a Mogu turn, but then go for a big swing turn, you can get all your minions onto the board, play your Mogus, and then trade off your minions, and your opponent won't be able to respond with a good Mogu turn of their own. Some other things to watch out for, MC Tech. Now, I wouldn't recommend in this deck never going above 3 minions. There's plenty of decks in Hearthstone right now where, against Quest Shaman, the correct thing to do is never play 4 or more minions, because the MC Tech is too good. But in this deck, there's a lot of tokens. There's a lot of 1/1s that you can create. There's lackeys, 2/3s, that sort of thing. And these things aren't devastating if you get hit by an MC Tech. Basically, we want to spread wide as we can most of the time, because we run things like Bloodlust, Stormbringer, Sea Giant, Mogu, etc, etc. All these cards get rewarded for wide boards. So although an MC Tech can hurt us, it's not something we want to be playing around. And if we do have to play into it, look to be setting up turns where the MC Tech isn't that good. Say you've got Thunderhead plus 5 other minions, which are just 1/1s. Well, an MC Tech there is usually going to be a bit garbage, and it's going to cost your opponent a lot of their turn to do that. Say your opponent's on turn 5 and you have a bunch of 1/1s and 1 big minion. Well, it's perfectly fine to play into an MC Tech there, because it's going to take up the majority of the opponent's turn, and all they're really going to be doing is stealing one of your small minions for the most part. One spot where I would start playing around MC Tech is if you've had a big swing turn with Mogu Flesh Shapers and a Mutate or a Sea Giant, etc., and you have a Thunderhead on board alongside them, and then suddenly you have maybe several big minions on the board. Well, in that spot, you can just limit yourself to 3 minions on the board instead of going super wide, because the M-Steady tech gets way more devastating when all the options available to steal are strong for them. In short, don't play around MC tech too much unless you have a very strong narrow board. Another card to watch out for is Sandstorm Elemental. This card can delete all your board of rush minions, so be careful of that one. There are going to be scenarios where things didn't go quite as planned in the early game and you're not as far ahead on board as you would like. But you have, like, say, a Bloodlust in hand or a Stormbringer in hand. In those scenarios, I would say just pretend Sandstorm Elemental's not a card. Just say, if you've got it, you got it, and I lose. But if you don't have it, I'm going to have a super wide board and I'm threatening Bloodlust, I'm threatening Stormbringers. And outside of the Sandstorm Elemental, the Quest Shaman itself doesn't have great ways of interacting with the board. So in scenarios when they don't have it, it's very easy to stick a super wide board and take advantage of those synergies. Next up, Quest Druid. Often the Quest Druid doesn't really do anything on the early turns. They're just developing nothing stats, not really interacting with the board. Maybe the best they can do is like a Wrath. That's excellent news for your 2-drops of Evil Totem and Underbelly Angler. These cards can snowball the board super well. If you drop an Evil Totem, pretty much just lives a lot of the time for 2, 3, 4 turns or so, and you get a bunch of Nakis out of it, which is great. Same thing goes for Underbelly Angler. If you have Underbelly Angler in the mulligan against Druid, it's super strong. If it sticks, you just get that free Murloc synergy, and you can just basically vomit onto the board that way. That's great for the early turns. What you want to be worried about is around turn 5, once they've completed their quest. The main things you want to be playing around are Starfall and Oasis Surger. The thing to do to play around Starfall is to try to get your minions on 3 health or better. Starfall does 7 to 1 target and 2 to everything else, but they often cost their entire turn to do that. So if you manage to get above any of those thresholds, those minions are not going to die in that circumstance. The best way to beat Druid is to make a board that their quest activated 5 mana play doesn't deal with, whether that be Oasis Surger or a Starfall. If they can't cleanly deal with whatever board you have, you're going to snowball the damage, snowball the board advantage, activate things like Bloodlust to potentially kill them in the future. What you really don't want to be doing is ending up with a really powerful early game against most decks, but Druid's just going to ignore that. And if that early game just completely dies to a Starfall, then you're just going to be in a terrible position going forward against the Druids mid-game turns, where they're definitely going to pull ahead if they get a huge Starfall off. Plenty of ways to play around that in this deck. Something like a Sea Giant is a great example of that, as the Starfall doesn't actually clear it, and they might be forced to send 2 Oasis Surges into it, and then you're still going to have the rest of your board still available to push damage. Overall, pretty decent matchup. I would say it's not nearly as favoured as the Priest or the Quest Shaman matches are, but still I'd say slightly favoured for our deck. Finally, we have Control Warrior. Now this matchup sucks for our deck because mainly a single Brawl can just take us out of the game. My main recommendation for beating Control Warriors is to go for a cheesy win with an Underbelly Angler. If you can get an early Underbelly Angler and a bunch of Murlocs, you can just snowball that into constant threat generation every single turn, and you can push enough damage that way to be able to kill them. One thing I will say, if you do get a successful Underbelly Angler start, is not to super tunnel vision on playing Murlocs every turn, even if you have an Underbelly Angler still alive. Remember, tempo is the name of the game at the end of the day. If you have other higher tempo plays, like say a Thunderhead plus removal if they put a big taunt in the way, or you have a Sea Giant that you can drop onto board, or you have a Stormbringer available to turn a lot of your things into huge threats, that's what you want to be doing, because you really need to be converting this value engine into a tempo engine, and the end goal really is to kill the warrior before they can find the answers. In terms of things like Brawl and stuff, I would recommend just not playing around it at all. You have a very limited window to win this matchup. A lot of the time, if they have a somewhat decent start into a Brawl to neutralize your board, even if you do play around the Brawl by not developing as many minions, you're still going to lose that game because you don't have enough resources to deal with the Warriors late game with what we have in deck. We're just going to get outvalued slowly. Instead, I really just recommend just going all in pretty much against the Warrior and just hoping they don't have it. You can play around things like Warpath way easier because we have a bunch of higher health things we can drop onto board before they have enough Warpaths available to clear them. But as for Brawl, I would strongly recommend just not playing around it. This is definitely the case with Sea Giant. It's a mistake I see players make all the time. They're like, they have a wide-ish board and they're like, I don't want to play my Sea Giant because it commits too much to an AoE. But the point is, if you do get AoE'd, the Sea Giant becomes unplayable anyway. So it's not really an overcommitment by playing a Sea Giant. It's really just a reward for having a wide board, and the Sea Giant itself is just pretty much unplayable outside of having a wide board. So you may as well commit it to any board where you can. That's all the matchups I'm going to talk about in this video, but the game plan is usually fairly similar in each one, where it's set up swing turns, particularly doing things like equipping Lickham and leaving your opponent with minions for a turn, and then maybe going Thunderhead plus Overload, swing your Lickham, play a Mogu, play a Sea Giant, do whatever, you know. Look for those big swing turns, because swing turns really make this deck, and tempo is king right now. I hope you enjoyed the deck. I hope you enjoyed this guide. I do stream on Twitch, so if you want to see me play the deck and talk through some of my plays, you can go check me out there. Otherwise, thanks for watching and good luck laddering.